Hello, my dear lore seekers. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories. Tonight, we journey into the shadowed corners of wizarding history, to a chapter often overlooked in the grand tales of heroic wizards and dark lords. It is a story etched in silver and gold, stained with blood and bitterness. A 500-year saga of conflict that has simmered beneath the cobblestones of Diagon Alley and echoed in the deepest vaults of Gringotts. Settle in, quiet your mind, and let us explore the long and tragic history of the Goblin Rebellions, a tale of injustice, cultural clashes, and a proud and ancient people's unending struggle for respect in a world that has long denied them. Before we begin, if you find value in our stories, please take a moment to like and subscribe, or check out our Patreon link in the description below. Your support is what allows us to continue these journeys together. We appreciate it more than you know. And now, let's begin. The heart of the conflict. A clash of cultures. Before we delve into the bloody and vicious rebellions that have scarred the relationship between wizards and goblins, we must first understand the goblins themselves. They are a proud and ancient race, with a culture and a form of magic that is uniquely their own. To the wizards who stride through the marble halls of Gringotts, goblins are often seen as little more than clever bankers and skilled metalsmiths, their lives and society a mystery. But to truly grasp the centuries of conflict, we must look beyond the teller's desks and into the heart of goblin civilization. Goblin society is a complex tapestry woven from threads of fierce loyalty, deep-seated traditions, and a profound respect for craftsmanship. They are a people who value skill and artistry above all else, and their creations are not mere objects, but extensions of their very being. A goblin-made sword or piece of armor is not simply a product to be bought and sold. It is a legacy, a testament to the maker's skill and a part of their soul. This fundamental belief is the bedrock of their culture, and it is here that the first seeds of conflict with the wizarding world were sown. You see, wizards and goblins have a fundamentally different understanding of ownership. To a wizard, a purchase is a final transaction. Gold is exchanged, and the object becomes theirs to do with as they please, to pass down through generations as a treasured heirloom. But to a goblin, a sale is merely a lease. The purchaser has the right to use the object for their lifetime, but upon their death, it should, by all that is right and proper in goblin culture, be returned to its maker or their descendants. The wizarding practice of passing down goblin-made artifacts is, in the eyes of the goblins, nothing short of theft. This clash of cultures is not a mere disagreement. It is a chasm of misunderstanding that has fueled centuries of resentment. Imagine the pride of a goblin smith pouring their heart and soul into a magnificent silver chalice, only to see it treated as a mere commodity by a wizarding family, passed from hand to hand without a thought for the one who created it. This, to the goblins, is a profound insult, a denial of their very identity as creators. And then there is the matter of magic. Goblins possess a powerful and ancient form of magic, one that does not require the use of a wand. They can shape metal and stone with their will, imbue their creations with enchantments that wizards can only marvel at, and perform feats of magic that are uniquely their own. Yet, in the wizarding world, they are denied the right to carry a wand, a right that is seen as the very symbol of magical ability. This ban, enforced by the Ministry of Magic, is a constant reminder of their second-class status, a declaration that their magic is somehow lesser, their people not to be trusted. It is a bitter irony that the wizards, who rely on the goblins to safeguard their fortunes, to mint their currency, and to craft their most precious artifacts, are the very ones who deny them the most basic of rights. The goblins see this hypocrisy, and it fuels a deep and abiding anger, a slow-burning fire that has time and again erupted into open rebellion. The history of goblin-wizard relations is a long and bloody one, a cycle of oppression, uprising, and brutal suppression. For centuries, the goblins have been treated as a subservient race, their rights curtailed, their culture dismissed, and their grievances ignored. They are subject to the laws of the Ministry of Magic, yet they have no voice in the Wizengamot, the Wizarding High Court. They are a vital part of the wizarding economy, yet they are seen as little more than servants. This systemic injustice, this constant denial of their worth, is the fertile ground from which the Goblin Rebellions have sprung. They are not simply the outbursts of a greedy and aggressive people, as many wizards would have you believe. They are the desperate cries of a proud and ancient race, fighting for their rights, for their culture, and for their very identity in a world that has sought to crush them. As we journey through the history of these rebellions, from the bloody fields of the 17th century to the simmering tensions of the modern era, we will see how this fundamental clash of cultures, this deep-seated prejudice, has shaped the wizarding world in ways that few truly understand. We will see how the goblins, time and again, have risen up against their oppressors, their hearts filled with a righteous fury, their hands wielding the very silver and steel that the wizards so covet. And we will see how time and again they have been beaten back, their hopes crushed, but their spirit never truly broken. This is not a simple story of good versus evil, of right versus wrong. It is a story of two cultures, two peoples, locked in a struggle that has spanned centuries. It is a story of injustice, of pride, and of the enduring power of a people who refuse to be forgotten. So, let us begin our journey into the heart of the Goblin Rebellions, and uncover the truth that lies buried beneath the vaults of Gringotts. The 17th century, the first sparks of rebellion, the first major Goblin Rebellion to be recorded in wizarding history, took place in 1612, a tumultuous year that would forever alter the course of goblin-wizard relations. The seeds of this conflict had been sown for centuries, in the fertile ground of prejudice and misunderstanding that we have already explored. The goblins, long treated as second-class citizens, had grown weary of the injustices they faced, and their simmering resentment was about to boil over. The immediate trigger for the 1612 rebellion was a series of new laws passed by the Wizengamot, laws that further curtailed the rights of goblins and other non-human magical beings. The most egregious of these was a reinforcement of the ban on goblins carrying wands, a law that was seen as a direct assault on their dignity and their ability to defend themselves. But it was not just the wand ban that fueled the goblins' anger. They were also denied representation in the Wizengamot, the very body that was passing these discriminatory laws. Their voices were silenced, their concerns dismissed, and their people left with no legal recourse. The rebellion began in the heart of the wizarding community, in the bustling village of Hogsmeade. It was here, in the shadow of Hogwarts itself, that the goblins made their stand. They chose as their headquarters one of the village's inns, a place where wizards and witches gathered to drink and socialize, a symbol of the very community that had excluded them. The choice was a deliberate one, a declaration that they would no longer be confined to the margins of wizarding society. The rebellion was led by a charismatic and cunning goblin named Vargo, a leader who had grown tired of the endless cycle of oppression. He rallied his people with fiery speeches, reminding them of their proud history, their ancient magic, and the injustices they had suffered. He spoke of a future where goblins would be treated as equals, where their culture would be respected, and where their rights would be protected. His words resonated with a people who had long been silenced, and they flocked to his banner, their hearts filled with a newfound hope. The rebellion began with a series of coordinated attacks on wizarding establishments in Hogsmeade. The goblins, using their own form of wandless magic and their mastery of metalwork, proved to be a formidable force. They were organized, disciplined, and fueled by a righteous anger that had been simmering for generations. The wizards of Hogsmeade were taken by surprise, their complacency shattered by the sudden and violent uprising. The Ministry of Magic was slow to react, their bureaucracy and their underestimation of the goblins' resolve proving to be a dangerous combination. By the time they had mustered a response, the rebellion had spread beyond Hogsmeade, with goblin communities across the country rising up in solidarity. The conflict escalated into a full-blown war, with bloody battles fought in the streets of wizarding villages and in the heart of the countryside. The wizards, with their superior numbers and their mastery of wand-based magic, eventually gained the upper hand. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, the goblin forces scattered, and their leaders captured. Vargo, the charismatic leader who had dared to dream of a better future for his people, was killed in battle, his death a devastating blow to the goblin cause. The aftermath of the 1612 rebellion was a dark time for the goblins. The Ministry of Magic, in a show of force, passed even harsher laws, further restricting their rights and freedoms. The wand ban was not only upheld, but also codified in the Code of Wand Use of 1631, making it a crime for any non-human to even possess a wand. The goblins were forced back into the shadows, their hopes of equality crushed, their people left to lick their wounds and mourn their dead. But the spirit of the rebellion was not extinguished. The memory of Vargo and his brave stand lived on in the hearts of the goblin people, a symbol of their enduring struggle for justice. The 1612 rebellion, though a military failure, was a turning point in goblin-wizard relations. It was the first time that the goblins had risen up in a large-scale, organized rebellion, and it sent a clear message to the wizarding world. The goblins would not be silenced, they would not be ignored, and they would not rest until they were treated with the respect they deserved. The 17th century was a time of great turmoil in the wizarding world, and the Goblin Rebellion of 1612 was not the only conflict to shake the foundations of magical society. Throughout the century, there were numerous smaller uprisings and skirmishes, each one a testament to the simmering tensions between wizards and goblins. These conflicts, though often overshadowed by the larger rebellion, were no less significant in the long and bloody history of their struggle. One of the most notable of these smaller conflicts was the Chipping Clodberry Riot, a violent outburst that took place in the mid-17th century. The details of this event are scarce, lost to the mists of time and the biased accounts of wizarding historians. What we do know is that it was a bloody and vicious affair, with both wizards and goblins suffering heavy casualties. The riot was sparked by a local dispute, a seemingly minor incident that quickly escalated into a full-blown confrontation. The root of the conflict, as with so many others, was the deep-seated prejudice and mistrust that existed between the two communities. The wizards of Chipping Clodberry, like so many others, saw the goblins as a lesser race, their culture and traditions to be dismissed and disdained. The goblins, in turn, saw the wizards as arrogant and oppressive, their laws and customs designed to keep them in a state of perpetual subjugation. The riot was a brutal and chaotic affair, with both sides resorting to violence and bloodshed. The wizards, with their wands and their organized magical training, had the advantage in open combat, but the goblins, with their fierce determination and their mastery of their own form of magic, were not easily defeated. They fought with a courage and a ferocity that surprised their wizarding opponents, their anger and frustration fueling their every blow. In the end, the riot was suppressed, the goblins once again forced to submit to the authority of the Ministry of Magic. But the conflict left a lasting scar on the community of Chipping Clodberry, a bitter reminder of the deep divisions that existed between wizards and goblins. The riot was a microcosm of the larger conflict, a small-scale reenactment of the same cycle of oppression and rebellion that had played out across the country. Throughout the 17th century, there were countless other incidents of this kind, each one adding to the growing list of grievances that the goblins held against the wizarding world. There were disputes over land, over resources, and over the ownership of goblin-made artifacts. There were acts of violence and discrimination, of prejudice and injustice, and with each new incident, the anger and resentment of the goblin people grew, their desire for freedom and equality burning ever brighter. The 17th century was a time of great change in the wizarding world. The International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy was established in 1692, a landmark piece of legislation that would forever alter the relationship between the magical and non-magical worlds. But for the goblins, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. They were still a people oppressed, their rights denied, their culture disrespected. The rebellions and riots of the 17th century were a clear indication that the goblins would not accept their fate passively. They were a people who would fight for their freedom, who would stand up against injustice, and who would never give up on their dream of a world where they were treated as equals. The 17th century may have ended with the goblins once again in a position of subjugation, but the seeds of future rebellions had been sown, and it was only a matter of time before they would once again rise up against their oppressors. The 18th century, a century of blood and fire. The 18th century dawned on a wizarding world that was still reeling from the conflicts of the previous century. The tensions between wizards and goblins had not abated. If anything, they had grown more intense, the wounds of past rebellions still fresh in the minds of both communities. The 18th century would prove to be an even bloodier and more violent chapter in their long and troubled history, a century of widespread rebellion that would shake the wizarding world to its very core. The first half of the 18th century was marked by a series of smaller, localized uprisings, each one a prelude to the larger conflict that was to come. These skirmishes were often sparked by the same issues that had fueled the rebellions of the 17th century: the wand ban, the dispute over ownership, and the general discrimination that goblins faced in their daily lives. But there was a new element to the conflicts of the 18th century, a new sense of organization and a new level of coordination among the goblin communities. The goblins had learned from the failures of the past. They had seen how their isolated uprisings had been easily crushed by the superior numbers and resources of the Ministry of Magic. They knew that if they were to have any hope of success, they would need to unite, to stand together as one people against their common enemy. And so, throughout the first half of the 18th century, they began to build a network of alliances, to share information, and to plan for a rebellion on a scale that the wizarding world had never seen before. The storm broke in 1752, a year that would be forever remembered in wizarding history as the year of the Great Goblin Rebellion. This was not a localized uprising, not a spontaneous outburst of anger. This was a carefully planned and coordinated rebellion, a declaration of war against the wizarding world. Goblin communities across the country rose up in unison, their armies marching under a single banner, their hearts united by a common cause. The rebellion was led by a council of goblin chieftains, a group of wise and experienced leaders who had spent years planning for this moment. They were skilled strategists, cunning tacticians, and fierce warriors, and they commanded the loyalty and respect of their people. Under their leadership, the goblin armies proved to be a formidable force. Their knowledge of the land and their mastery of their own form of magic, giving them a significant advantage in the early stages of the conflict. The rebellion of 1752 was also notable for the alliances that the goblins forged with other marginalized magical beings. The werewolves, long persecuted and feared by the wizarding community, saw in the Goblin Rebellion a chance to fight back against their own oppressors. They joined forces with the goblins, their ferocity and their strength adding a new and terrifying dimension to the rebel armies. The alliance was a powerful one, a union of two peoples who had been pushed to the fringes of society, their shared experience of discrimination and injustice binding them together in a common cause. The Ministry of Magic was once again caught off guard, their arrogance and their underestimation of the goblins' resolve proving to be a costly mistake. The rebellion spread like wildfire, with wizarding towns and villages falling to the rebel armies. The Ministry's response was disorganized and ineffective, their forces struggling to contain the widespread and coordinated attacks. The rebellion was so successful in its early stages that it led to the resignation of two successive ministers for magic, Albert Boot and Basil Flack, their careers destroyed by their inability to quell the uprising. The tide of the war began to turn with the appointment of Hephaestus Gore as the new minister for magic. Gore was a seasoned auror, a man who had spent his life fighting dark wizards and who understood the realities of magical warfare. He was a ruthless and determined leader, and he brought a new level of organization and discipline to the Ministry's forces. Under his command, the wizarding armies began to push back against the rebels, their superior numbers and their mastery of wand-based magic slowly but surely turning the tide of the war. The Rebellion of 1752 was a long and bloody conflict, with both sides suffering immense casualties. The battles were fierce and brutal, with no quarter given and no mercy shown. The fields of the English countryside were stained with the blood of wizards, goblins, and werewolves, the air filled with the sounds of battle and the cries of the dying. It was a dark and terrible time, a war that would leave a lasting scar on the wizarding world. In the end, the rebellion was crushed. The goblin and werewolf armies were defeated, their leaders captured or killed, and their people once again forced to submit to the authority of the Ministry of Magic. The werewolves were subjected to even harsher laws and regulations, their brief taste of freedom replaced by a new era of persecution. The goblins, too, faced the wrath of the victorious wizards, their hopes of equality and justice once again dashed against the rocks of wizarding prejudice. But the rebellion of 1752 was not a complete failure. It had shown the wizarding world that the goblins were a force to be reckoned with, a people who would not be easily silenced or subdued. It had also exposed the deep divisions and injustices that existed within magical society, the simmering tensions that lay just beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful world. The rebellion may have been defeated, but the spirit of resistance lived on, the dream of a better future still burning in the hearts of the goblin people. The 18th century was a century of blood and fire, a century of rebellion and suppression, but it was also a century of courage and defiance, a century that would forever be remembered as a testament to the enduring strength and resilience of the Goblin Nation. Urg the Unclean, a symbol of defiance. The 18th century was a century of rebellion, a time when the simmering tensions between wizards and goblins erupted into open warfare. But the Great Goblin Rebellion of 1752 was not the only conflict to shake the wizarding world during this tumultuous period. Throughout the century, there were numerous other uprisings and skirmishes, each one a testament to the goblins' unwavering determination to fight for their rights and their freedom. And it was during this time of constant conflict that one of the most infamous figures in goblin history rose to prominence: Urg the Unclean. Urg the Unclean was a goblin of humble origins, a simple metalsmith who had grown up in the shadow of wizarding oppression. He had witnessed firsthand the injustices that his people faced, the daily humiliations, the constant reminders of their second-class status. He had seen his friends and family suffer at the hands of arrogant and prejudiced wizards, their lives and their livelihoods at the mercy of a system that was designed to keep them down. And in his heart, a fire of rebellion began to burn. The event that would transform Urg from a humble smith into a feared rebel leader was a seemingly minor incident, a single act of cruelty that would have far-reaching consequences. One day, in a small wizarding village, Urg was publicly humiliated by a group of young wizards. They mocked his appearance, they insulted his people, and in a final act of degradation, they dunked him in the village pond, their laughter echoing in his ears as he struggled for breath. That day, something inside Urg snapped. The years of pent-up anger and frustration, the lifetime of endured indignities, it all came rushing to the surface. He emerged from the pond a changed goblin, his heart filled with a burning desire for revenge. He would no longer be a victim. He would no longer be a passive observer of his people's suffering. He would be a warrior, a leader, a symbol of goblin resistance. Urg the Unclean, as he came to be known, was a charismatic and ruthless leader. He rallied his fellow goblins with his fiery speeches, his words a potent mixture of anger, pride, and hope. He spoke of a new world, a world where goblins would be free, where they would be treated as equals, and where they would no longer have to bow to the will of their wizarding oppressors. His message resonated with a people who were hungry for change, and they flocked to his banner, their hearts filled with a newfound sense of purpose. Urg's rebellion was not a large-scale, coordinated uprising like the rebellion of 1752. It was a guerrilla war, a campaign of hit-and-run attacks, of sabotage and subterfuge. Urg and his followers were a constant thorn in the side of the Ministry of Magic. Their raids on wizarding settlements and their disruption of magical trade routes, causing chaos and confusion throughout the country. They were a small but determined force. Their knowledge of the land and their mastery of their own form of magic, making them a difficult enemy to defeat. Urg the Unclean became a legend in his own time, a hero to the goblins and a villain to the wizards. He was a symbol of defiance, a goblin who had dared to stand up to the might of the wizarding world. His name was whispered in the taverns of Hogsmeade and in the halls of the Ministry of Magic, his exploits the subject of both fear and admiration. He was the most wanted goblin in the country, his face on posters in every wizarding town and village, a testament to the threat that he posed to the established order. But Urg's rebellion, like so many others, was ultimately doomed to fail. The Ministry of Magic, with its vast resources and its powerful aurors, eventually tracked him down. He was captured in a fierce battle, his followers scattered, and his rebellion brought to an end. He was imprisoned in Azkaban, the wizarding prison. His fiery spirit finally contained within its cold and unforgiving walls. Urg the Unclean may have been defeated, but his legacy lived on. He had shown his people that it was possible to fight back, that it was possible to resist, and that even a single goblin could make a difference. He had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that the spirit of rebellion could never be truly extinguished. And though he would spend the rest of his days in a dark and lonely cell, his name would forever be remembered in the annals of goblin history, a testament to the enduring power of a people who would never give up on their dream of freedom. The 18th century was a century of heroes and villains, of rebels and oppressors. It was a century that saw the rise and fall of great leaders, both wizard and goblin. And it was a century that would forever be remembered as a time of great conflict and great change, a time when the fate of the wizarding world hung in the balance. The story of Urg the Unclean is just one of many from this tumultuous period, a single thread in the rich and complex tapestry of goblin-wizard relations. But it is a story that speaks to the heart of the conflict, a story of injustice, of defiance, and of the unquenchable thirst for freedom that has driven the goblin people for centuries. The 19th century, the economic rebellion. The 18th century was a century of open warfare, a time when the conflict between wizards and goblins was fought on the battlefields of the English countryside. But the 19th century brought a new kind of conflict, a new kind of struggle. The open rebellions of the past had been brutally suppressed, the goblin armies defeated, and their leaders imprisoned. The wizards had reasserted their dominance, their control over the magical world seemingly absolute. But beneath the surface of this enforced peace, the embers of rebellion still glowed, the goblins' desire for freedom and equality undiminished. The 19th century was a century of political and social change in the wizarding world. The Ministry of Magic, in an attempt to prevent future rebellions, began to implement a series of reforms, ostensibly aimed at improving the lives of non-human magical beings. The Goblin Liaison Office was established, a department within the ministry that was supposed to represent the interests of the goblin community. But in reality, these reforms were little more than a smokescreen, a way for the ministry to maintain its control while appearing to be benevolent and progressive. The Goblin Liaison Office was a powerless and ineffective body, its goblin representatives given no real authority and their concerns largely ignored. The wand ban remained in place, a constant symbol of the goblins' second-class status. The dispute over ownership continued to simmer, with the ministry refusing to recognize the goblins' cultural claims to their own creations. The systemic injustice that had fueled the rebellions of the past was still very much in place, the only difference being that it was now hidden behind a veneer of bureaucracy and political correctness. The goblins, for their part, had not given up on their struggle. They had simply changed their tactics. The open warfare of the 18th century had been replaced by a new kind of resistance, a more subtle and insidious form of rebellion. The goblins began to use their control over the wizarding economy as a weapon, their mastery of finance, and their position at the head of Gringotts, giving them a new kind of leverage over their wizarding oppressors. Gringotts Wizarding Bank, founded in 1474 by the Goblin Gringott, had long been a symbol of the complex and often contradictory relationship between wizards and goblins. It was a place of cooperation, a place where the two communities came together to conduct their business. But it was also a place of subjugation, a place where the goblins, despite their control over the wizarding economy, were still subject to the laws and regulations of the Ministry of Magic. In the 19th century, Gringotts became a battleground, a place where the goblins fought for their rights not with swords and spells, but with contracts and interest rates. They used their financial acumen to their advantage, their shrewd business practices, and their control over the flow of gold, giving them a new kind of power over the wizarding world. They were no longer just the bankers of the magical community. They were its economic masters, their decisions and their policies having a profound impact on the lives of every witch and wizard in the country. This new form of rebellion was not without its risks. The Ministry of Magic was well aware of the goblins' growing economic power, and they viewed it with a mixture of fear and suspicion. There were constant attempts to regulate Gringotts, to bring it under the direct control of the ministry, and to limit the goblins' influence over the wizarding economy. But the goblins were clever and resourceful, their centuries of experience in the world of finance having taught them how to navigate the treacherous waters of wizarding politics. The 19th century was a century of quiet rebellion, a century of economic warfare. The goblins had learned that they could not defeat the wizards on the battlefield, but they could challenge them in the marketplace. They had learned that power did not just come from the tip of a wand, but also from the clink of a galleon. And they had learned that the pen, or in their case, the ledger, could be mightier than the sword. But the old grievances had not been forgotten. The wand ban, the ownership dispute, the general discrimination that they faced, these were still very much a part of their daily lives. And though they had found a new way to fight for their rights, the anger and resentment that had fueled the rebellions of the past still simmered beneath the surface. The 19th century may have been a time of relative peace, but it was a fragile peace, a peace that was built on a foundation of injustice and inequality. And it was only a matter of time before the embers of rebellion would once again be fanned into a raging fire. The 20th century would bring new challenges, new conflicts, and a new generation of goblins who were not content to fight their battles in the ledgers of Gringotts. The stage was set for a new chapter in their long and bloody struggle, a chapter that would be written not in ink, but in blood. The 20th century, a wizard's war. The 20th century was a century of unprecedented change in the wizarding world. The rise of two dark lords, Grindelwald and Voldemort, plunged the magical community into a state of constant fear and turmoil. The old certainties were shattered, the old alliances tested, and the very fabric of magical society was torn apart. And in the midst of this chaos, the goblins, as always, found themselves caught in the crossfire. Their own struggle for freedom and equality overshadowed by the larger conflict that was raging around them. The first half of the 20th century was dominated by the rise of Gellert Grindelwald, a dark wizard whose ambition and power threatened to engulf the entire magical world. Grindelwald's ideology of wizarding supremacy, his belief that wizards were the rightful rulers of the world, was a terrifying prospect for all non-human magical beings. The goblins, who had long suffered under the yoke of wizarding oppression, knew that a world ruled by Grindelwald would be a world where their rights and freedoms would be completely extinguished. And so, for the first time in their long and bloody history, the goblins found themselves fighting alongside the wizards, their old enmities set aside in the face of a common enemy. They joined the international coalition of wizards that was formed to combat Grindelwald, their skills in finance and their mastery of metalwork proving to be invaluable assets in the war effort. They funded the armies, they forged the weapons, and they fought on the front lines, their courage and their determination earning them a newfound respect from their wizarding allies. But this newfound alliance was a fragile one, a temporary truce in a centuries-long conflict. The old prejudices and mistrust had not disappeared. They had simply been put on hold, and when Grindelwald was finally defeated, when the threat of his dark reign had been lifted, the old tensions between wizards and goblins quickly resurfaced. The wizards, once again secure in their position of power, forgot the sacrifices that the goblins had made, the role that they had played in their victory. The old discriminatory laws remained in place, the old grievances unresolved. The goblins had helped to save the wizarding world, but they were still not a part of it. The second half of the 20th century brought a new and even more terrifying threat: Lord Voldemort. Voldemort's ideology was not one of wizarding supremacy, but of pure-blood supremacy. He sought to create a world where only those of pure wizarding blood would be allowed to live, a world where all others, including goblins, would be exterminated. The goblins, once again, found themselves facing a threat to their very existence. But this time, their response was different. The betrayal that they had felt after the war against Grindelwald had left a bitter taste in their mouths. They had fought alongside the wizards, they had bled alongside them, and they had been rewarded with nothing but a return to the status quo. They were no longer willing to be the pawns in a wizard's war, to fight and die for a community that refused to accept them as equals. And so, when Voldemort rose to power, the goblins remained neutral. They declared that it was a wizard's war, a conflict that did not concern them. They closed the doors of Gringotts to both sides, their vaults and their treasures sealed off from the outside world. They would not help the wizards, but they would not help Voldemort either. They would simply wait and see which side emerged victorious. This neutrality was a controversial decision, one that was met with anger and condemnation from the wizarding community. The wizards, who had come to rely on the goblins' financial support, saw their neutrality as a betrayal, a cowardly act of self-preservation. But the goblins saw it as a necessary one, a way to protect their people from a conflict that was not of their making. They had learned from the past that their loyalty to the wizards was not reciprocated, that their sacrifices were not appreciated. They would no longer be the foot soldiers in a war that was not their own. But neutrality was a difficult position to maintain in a world that was being torn apart by war. Voldemort, in his quest for power, had no respect for the goblins' neutrality. He saw Gringotts not as a neutral territory, but as a treasure trove to be plundered. He and his Death Eaters launched a series of attacks on the bank, their attempts to seize control of the wizarding economy, a direct assault on the goblins' autonomy. The goblins fought back, their ancient magic and their formidable defenses proving to be a match for even the darkest of wizards. The halls of Gringotts, once a place of commerce and finance, became a battlefield, the air filled with the sounds of spells and the clash of steel. The goblins, who had tried to remain neutral, were once again drawn into the conflict, their own survival now at stake. The 20th century was a century of war and betrayal, a century that tested the resolve of the goblin people in ways that they had never been tested before. They had fought alongside the wizards, and they had been betrayed. They had tried to remain neutral, and they had been attacked. They had learned that in a world at war, there was no safe harbor, no place to hide from the storm. And it was in the midst of this chaos, in the final days of the Second Wizarding War, that a single goblin would make a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, a decision that would once again bring the long and bloody history of goblin-wizard relations to the forefront of the magical world. His name was Griphook, and his story is a story of betrayal, of revenge, and of the enduring power of a people who would not be forgotten. Griphook's betrayal, a goblin's revenge. Griphook was a goblin of Gringotts, a teller who had spent his life in the service of the bank. He was a proud and intelligent goblin, a master of his craft, and a staunch believer in the traditions and values of his people. He had seen firsthand the arrogance and the prejudice of the wizards who came to Gringotts, their casual disdain for the goblins who guarded their fortunes. And in his heart, a deep and abiding resentment had taken root. Griphook's story intersects with that of Harry Potter in the final days of the Second Wizarding War. Harry, in his quest to destroy Voldemort's Horcruxes, had discovered that one of them, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, was hidden in the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange, deep within the bowels of Gringotts. He knew that he could not break into the bank alone, that he would need the help of a goblin, someone who knew the secrets of its labyrinthine tunnels and its formidable defenses. And so he sought out Griphook, who had recently escaped from Malfoy Manor, where he had been held captive and tortured by the Death Eaters. Harry offered Griphook a deal. If he would help them break into the Lestrange vault, he would give him the Sword of Gryffindor, a priceless goblin-made artifact that had been in the possession of wizards for centuries. The sword was a symbol of everything that the goblins had lost, a testament to their skill and their artistry, and a constant reminder of the wizards' theft of their cultural heritage. To Griphook, the sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of his people's pride, a piece of their soul that had been stolen from them. Griphook agreed to the deal, But his motives were not as simple as they seemed. He did not trust Harry. He did not trust any wizard. He had seen too much. He had suffered too much to believe in the promises of a wand carrier. He saw in Harry's offer not an act of generosity, but an opportunity for revenge, a chance to reclaim what was rightfully his, and to strike a blow against the wizarding world that had oppressed his people for so long. The break-in at Gringotts was a daring and dangerous affair, a feat that had never been accomplished before. With Griphook's help, Harry, Ron, and Hermione managed to bypass the bank's formidable defenses, to navigate its treacherous tunnels, and to reach the Lestrange vault. They found the Horcrux, the cup of Helga Hufflepuff, and for a moment, it seemed as though their mission had been a success. But Griphook had no intention of letting them escape with both the cup and the sword. As soon as they had the Horcrux in their possession, he betrayed them. He seized the sword of Gryffindor, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant and vengeful light, and he abandoned them in the depths of the vault, their escape now seemingly impossible. Griphook's betrayal was a shocking and a brutal act, but it was not without its reasons. In his mind, he was not betraying Harry. He was simply taking what was rightfully his. The sword was a goblin creation, and by goblin law, it belonged to his people. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. He had helped them get into the vault, and now he was claiming his payment. He did not see it as a betrayal, but as a just and righteous act, a small victory in the long and bloody war against the wizards. But Griphook's victory was short-lived. In the chaos that followed the break-in, he was killed by Voldemort, his life cut short by the very Dark Lord that he had, in his own way, been fighting against. His death was a tragic and a lonely one, a testament to the brutal and unforgiving nature of the war that had consumed the wizarding world. The story of Griphook is a complex and a tragic one, a story that encapsulates the centuries of conflict and misunderstanding between wizards and goblins. He was not a hero, but he was not a villain either. He was a product of his time, a goblin who had been shaped by the injustices and the prejudices of the world in which he lived. His betrayal of Harry was not an act of pure malice, but an act of desperation. An act of a proud and oppressed people fighting for their rights and their dignity. The break-in at Gringotts was a turning point in the Second Wizarding War, a pivotal moment that would have far-reaching consequences. But it was also a turning point in the long and bloody history of goblin-wizard relations. It was a moment that exposed the deep and abiding mistrust that still existed between the two communities, a moment that showed that even in the face of a common enemy, the old wounds had not healed, the old grievances had not been forgotten. The war against Voldemort may have been won, but the war for goblin rights, the war for justice and equality, was far from over. The future, a path to reconciliation. The defeat of Lord Voldemort brought an end to the Second Wizarding War, and a new era of peace and prosperity dawned on the wizarding world. The dark clouds of fear and oppression that had hung over the magical community for so long had finally lifted. lifted, and there was a sense of hope and optimism in the air. But for the goblins, the end of the war did not bring the changes that they had so long been fighting for. The old prejudices, the old injustices, they remained, a stubborn and a bitter stain on the fabric of magical society. In the years that followed the war, there were some small signs of progress. Hermione Granger, who had always been a champion of the rights of magical creatures, took a position at the Ministry of Magic in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. She worked tirelessly to improve the lives of house elves, and she also advocated for the rights of goblins, her voice a lone beacon of reason and compassion in a sea of indifference and prejudice. But the wheels of change turn slowly in the wizarding world, and the deep-seated prejudices that had fueled the centuries of conflict were not easily overcome. The wand ban remained in place, a constant symbol of the goblins' second-class status. The dispute over ownership continued to be a source of tension, with the ministry refusing to acknowledge the goblins' cultural claims to their own creations. The goblins were still a people on the margins of society, their contributions to the wizarding world still largely unacknowledged and unappreciated. The question of whether true reconciliation between wizards and goblins is possible is a complex and a difficult one. The wounds of the past are deep, the scars of centuries of conflict not easily healed. The fundamental clash of cultures, the deep-seated mistrust, the long and bloody history of oppression and rebellion, these are all formidable obstacles to any lasting peace. For true reconciliation to occur, there would need to be a fundamental shift in the attitudes of the wizarding community. They would need to acknowledge the injustices of the past, to recognize the validity of the goblins' grievances, and to be willing to make meaningful changes to their laws and their society. They would need to see the goblins not as a lesser race, not as a subservient people, but as equals, as partners in the magical world. The wand ban would need to be lifted, the goblins given the right to carry a symbol of magical ability that has so long been denied to them. The dispute over ownership would need to be resolved, a compromise reached that respects both the wizarding concept of purchase and the goblin concept of creation. The goblins would need to be given a voice in the Wizengamot, a seat at the table where the laws that govern their lives are made. These are not small changes. They are not easy changes. They would require a level of empathy, of understanding, and of political will that has long been absent in the wizarding world. But they are necessary changes, for without them, the cycle of conflict and rebellion will continue. The embers of resentment will continue to smolder, and the dream of a truly just and equal magical society will remain just that, a dream. The story of the Goblin Rebellions is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the destructive power of prejudice and the enduring consequences of injustice. It is a story that is not just about wizards and goblins, but about all of us, about our own world, and our own struggles for equality and respect. It is a story that teaches us that peace cannot be built on a foundation of oppression. That true harmony can only be achieved when all voices are heard, when all cultures are respected, and when all people are treated with the dignity and the humanity that they deserve. The future of goblin-wizard relations remains uncertain. The path to reconciliation is a long and a difficult one, and there are many obstacles in the way. But there is also hope. Hope that the lessons of the past have been learned. Hope that the new generation of wizards and witches will be more open-minded, more compassionate, and more willing to build a better world. A world where goblins and wizards can live together, not as enemies, not as masters and servants, but as equals, as friends, as partners in the magical world. The story of the Goblin Rebellions is a story that is still being written, a story whose final chapter has yet to be penned, and it is up to the wizards and the goblins of the future to decide what that chapter will be, whether it will be a chapter of continued conflict and division, or a chapter of reconciliation, of healing, and of a new and a lasting peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadowed corners of wizarding history. I hope that this story has given you a new perspective on the complex and often tragic history of the goblin people, and a deeper understanding of the long and arduous struggle for justice that has defined their existence. Until we meet again for another evening of shared stories, I wish you all a peaceful and a restful night. Thank you for listening,